This entire video will just be about the definitions of objective and subjective. And so let's look up a definition of objective. And here's from freedictionary.com. 1. Of or having to do with a material object. 2. Having actual existence or reality. 3a. Uninfluenced by emotions or personal prejudices. An objective critic would be an example. 3b. Based on observable phenomena presented factually. Now, the definition of subjective from that same site. 1a. Proceeding from or taking place in a person's mind rather than the external world. 1b. Particular to a given person, personal, subjective experience. 2. Moodily introspective. 3. Existing only in the mind, illusory. 4 is a psychology definition, existing only within the experiencer's mind. I left out a few definitions that were specific to various fields, such as the medical field, and definitions that had to do with grammar, and so I do not believe they are relevant. The links to these definitions will be in the description in case one thinks I left out an important definition here. Now, let's use an example. Bob may want a nice car, and Jim may want some water because otherwise Jim will die. By definition 3b of objective, both of these values can be considered objective. While we cannot point with apodictic certainty, we can point to general parts of the brain where these thoughts, these values occur. And so we can say that these values, as defined as some neural firing structure, whatever, do objectively exist because value is just a label for that. But the other definitions of objective, I do not see how value can fit into that. But we can also see that Jim wanting water is something going on in his mind or his brain, as is Bob wanting a nice car, which fits definition 1a. I would say value is also subjective by definition 1b, 3, and 4. Definition 2 doesn't really describe what any of us are talking about. I know there's no such thing as a mind, and that these definitions are really just referencing the brain. Okay, now let's look at Merriam-Webster's definition. For objective, 1a. Relating to or existing as an object of thought without consideration of independent existence, used chiefly in medieval philosophy. 1b. Of, relating to, or being an object, phenomenon, or condition in the realm of sensible experience independent of individual thought and perceptible by all observers, having reality independent of the mind, or objective reality. 1c. Of a symptom of disease, perceptible to persons other than the affected individual. 1d. Involving or deriving from sense perception or experience with actual objects, conditions, or phenomena. Objective awareness or objective data. 3a. Expressing or dealing with facts or conditions as perceived without distortion by personal feeling, prejudices, or interpretation, right? Like objective art is the example they use. I don't know why they use that example, but better examples are an objective history of the war, an objective judgment, right? Or for like a test, limited to choices of fixed alternatives, like a multiple choice test, thus reducing subjective factors to a minimum. Now, Merriam-Webster's definition of subjective. 1a. Of, relating to, or constituting a subject. Okay. Of, relating to, or characteristic of one that is a subject, especially in lack of freedom of action or in submissiveness. 2. Of, or relating to, the essential being of that which has substance, qualities, attributes, or relations. 3a. Characteristic of or belonging to reality as perceived rather than as being independent of mind. Phenomenology, or phenomenal, it just says. 3b. Relating to or being experience or knowledge as conditioned by personal mental characteristics or states. 4a1. Peculiar to a particular individual, such as being personal, subjective judgments. 4a2. Modified or affected by personal views, experience, or background. 4b. Arising from conditions within the brain or sense organs and not directly caused by external stimuli, right? Subjective sensations. 4c. Arising out of or identified by means of one's perception of one's own states and processes. And 5, lacking in reality or substance, illusory. Okay, so again, let's take Bob and Jim. Bob wants a nice car, Jim wants water to live. So can either Bob or Jim's values be objective by the Merriam-Webster definitions? For 1A, an example would be a rock. And another example would be a bundle of neurons firing in a way we consider to create the sensation of value, and so value can be objective by definition 1A. For definition 1B, definitely not. As value does not exist independent of the mind, which, since hopefully nobody here is still a mind-body dualist, I will take to mean brain. So no, value does not exist outside of the brain, so by definition 1B, value is not objective. This includes the value to live. 1C doesn't seem to apply to this conversation, and I should have thrown it out, but I already made this picture, so moving on. For 1D, yes, value can be objective by this definition, as one can develop a value that comes from his experience with the world. For example, Jim values water because he knows it will quench his thirst. Similarly, Bob wants a nice car because he knows people will view him as being high class if he has one. So both Bob and Jim's values are objective by this definition. For 3A, value is again definitely not objective, as value comes from personal feelings, interpretations, and prejudgments. For subjective, definition 1A, value is certainly something a subject, in this case a person, has. At least the type of people the Amazing Atheist is talking about, or what we would consider conscious beings. Value is subjective by definition 2, as it does relate to the essential being, whatever. In this case, the essential being humans. For definition 3A, yes, that's perfect. Yes, value is subjective by that as well. 3B is also good, a good definition of subjective, making reference to, quote, mental, close quote, states, which I will interpret as meaning stuff going on in the brain. For A1, yes, value is peculiar to a particular individual and is thus personal. Only you can want you. That's not true. Only you can have your values, right? So, yeah, someone else can't have your values. Someone can value the same thing, but they're not. But that's a different neural cluster going on in their brain. Okay. For A2, yes, values are affected by those things, personal views, experience, or background. For B, yes, by directly caused by external stimuli, I assume they mean by something like an electrode. And I guess they're saying if it's caused by physical manipulation of the brain, either by electrode or by someone's hands, then it's objective. Indirect manipulation would be something like someone talking to you and you reacting to that. And we could have a whole discussion about how to define this, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. For C, yes, definitely. For definition 5, for subjective, I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter because nobody important is using the term subjective to mean illusory. So from both Webster and freedictionary.com, we can see that value being subjective fits more definitions than value being objective. Furthermore, the way value can be considered objective is if we point to some patterns of neurons and say, look, the neurons are firing in that way. And they are, objectively. But I would respond to this definition of objective in 2 ways. One, I would point out, pointing to neurons firing in a certain manner only shows that value, as we label those neurons, exists. In the brain, which is the subject we are talking about, right? The brain is the subject. The other way I would respond is by reductio ad absurdum. If we say that all things going on in the brain are objective, then there is no such thing as subjective. Okay. Now, the Amazing Atheist position is not that all value is objective, but only some. But any line he draws is going to be arbitrary. Jim will die if he doesn't get water. So what? The desire to live still only exists in Jim's brain. 99% of people on Earth agree that Jim should get water. So what? Their values still only exist in their brains. 100% of people agree with Jim, and then they give him some water. So what? The value still only existing in their brains. I believe the reason the Amazing Atheist is using the term objective value is so he can then say that a welfare state must satisfy these objective values and avoid saying that the state should provide all value by drawing some sort of distinction between objective and subjective value. All that said, TJ's practical argument can be seen as absurd if analyzed from a historical point of view. It's a truism that people living at the poverty line today have a higher standard of living than the kings of yore. And so what the Amazing Atheist calls objective/universal/baseline values were things nobody had 1,000 years ago. And if you study the history of socialist thought, what you will see is that the bare necessities are always changing. And because of this, it cannot be objective because it's dependent on someone's perception of what the bare necessities are. But all this becomes irrelevant because the best way to raise the standard of living for the bottom 1% in the long run is to have a free market.